Hi, my name's Orlando, and today I'm going to show you how to make this modern burlap TV console.
Full disclosure, we got inspiration for this piece from a model that we saw at Target. They didn't have the size we wanted, so our only option was to build something similar. I was able to make both the base and the frame out of 2 oak boards. These boards are 1 inch thick and 3.5 inches wide, so I started ripping them down to their final size. After ripping the boards, the new width was 1.5 inches, and I even had a tiny strip of wood left over. Be sure to remember that little strip of wood, because we're definitely going to use it later. With all the boards ripped to size, I moved on to making my base. I started off with what would be the depth of the TV stand. I made my initial cut, and after that I stopped measuring. I just used that initial piece as a reference for the other ones. I understand that might be confusing, so let me explain. In this case, the boards for the legs and the depth of the TV stand are all going to be the same size. Line up both of your pieces on the opposite side, and then push your reference piece towards the blade while it's not moving. When everything's lined up, move the reference piece out of the way, and you can start cutting. This gives you a near perfect cut every time because it takes away so much of the human error. This gave me 6 pieces that were all the same size, and then I made 2 long stretchers for the length of the TV stand. Next, we want to create the illusion that there's a gap between the base and the body of the TV console. To do that, you're going to have to put the table saw blade pretty close to the fence. You can also use a sacrificial fence if that's your preference. Now you just want to run your boards through the table saw. Take your time and make sure to put the gap on all the sides that will be facing outwards. I did this to all my pieces, including the 2 long stretchers that I mentioned earlier. Then I moved on to making my base. I didn't do anything too complicated, I just used pocket holes. This will give you an idea of how the middle stretcher is going to connect to the leg. Pocket holes are strong, but I also opted into using some wood glue just to make sure everything was secure. Once I attached both legs to the stretcher, it looks something like this. I also made some pocket holes into my long stretchers, and then attached those to the leg assemblies. These parts were a little difficult to work with, but it's because the TV console is so long. The final length ended up being something like 64 inches. Maybe this will give some perspective, since these toolboxes are pretty big. The next day, I went to go get some plywood, which would make up most of the body of the console. I had 2 of these pieces ripped down to a width of 17 inches, and the remaining piece was 14 inches. These pieces were all 8 feet long, so I cut them down into more manageable pieces. For the time being, we're only going to use the ones with a width of 17 inches. I cut this down to size, and I made sure it was 2 inches shorter than my base. This is to accommodate the 2 side panels that we still need to add, and each of these is going to be 1 inch thick. This sheet was a little bit deeper than what my miter saw could handle, but that wasn't too big of a deal because I could just turn it over and line up the blade with what was already cut. After I fully made this cut, I used this board as a reference for my other board as well. Since these are going to be the top and bottom, it's super important that they're both the same size. I mentally divided the top and bottom boards into 3 sections, and I used a combination square to mark out 3 equal parts. These lines are going to be where our middle dividers are going to go. This is our middle divider. Right now I'm using a Milescraft doweling jig to perfectly center a few dowel holes. With the dowels in place on the board, all I had to do was push up the jig against the board. The jig has a line on the side that should line up with the line that we created earlier. With everything in place, this is going to create a quick and easy alignment between the dividing board and the bottom of the console. I also made sure to label each dividing board just to make sure I knew where everything went. It's not really necessary, but it'll definitely save you time. And this goes without saying, but make sure you measure the fitment before you actually glue everything together. Since my fitment was good, I started adding glue to my boards. Then I added my dowels and made sure to put glue on those too. After adding both of the middle dividers, I clamped the whole thing together and let it dry overnight. In the meantime, I was able to work on the panels for the sides. And keep in mind that the method used for the side panels is going to be the same one as the one that I used for the console doors. So I started by cutting 2 pieces to match the height of the console without the base. And after that, I cut another 2 pieces to match the depth. This would give you 4 pieces that you can put together kind of like a picture frame. To join these pieces, I just used a little jig that I made in 2 minutes. It's just a little block of wood with a perfectly centered hole in it. It also has a line that corresponds with that hole, and that shows me where I can drill to make space for the dowel. So if you use this method, you can draw a couple of lines between 2 mating pieces, and then use the jig to drill a hole into every line. And after all the spaces for the dowels are made, you're free to glue everything up. Make sure everything's square, and feel free to use some clamps to hold everything in place while the glue dries. You remember how I mentioned the thin strip of wood from earlier? It's going to come in handy at this point. I put a thin layer of glue over the exposed plywood edge, and this is so we can cover it up with a thin strip of wood. I put the strip over the front facing edge, and then I held it together with tape. Wood glue is insanely strong, so the bond will be just right. When the glue dried, I cut off the overhanging pieces, and then I started taking off all the tape. This made it super easy to come back with a flush trim router bit and remove any excess. And once the side panels dried, I was able to attach them to the body. I put pocket holes on the bottom of the console facing outwards, and then I did the same with the top, since they wouldn't be visible. I gave the plywood edge a thin layer of glue, and then I started attaching the side panel. And I of course did this to both sides. Just keep that panel's design in mind, because it's also how you make your console doors. I added more of the thin wooden strips to any other exposed pieces of plywood, and then I started working on the doors. I used a wooden block to space out the door hinges so that they were about an inch away from the front side. Spacing it out this way makes it as to where doors that are 3/4 of an inch can sit flush with the surface. So I gave it a test run and then secured the door. The hinge worked great, but then I needed some latches to prevent the door from going inside. This part was pretty straightforward. You just make sure that the door lines up with the face of the console, and then secure the latch in place with the screws provided. These latches do also have a mating piece that attaches to the door, so make sure to secure that as well. Once that works, we can get back to the base.
Hey, sorry, I meant the base for the TV console. Oh, sorry.
This is probably the most unconventional way to do it, but this is how I did it. I drilled pocket holes on the inside of the base facing upwards so that I can attach the base to the body of the console. Most of the frame was done at this point, so I just had to add an important detail. I routed all the outside edges with a roundover bit because this was a feature that was pretty dominant on the original piece. While my router was out, I also used it to make the door handles. I routed one side with the roundover bit, and then I used a cove bit on the opposite side. This is going to create a groove on the inside that's going to make the handle pretty easy to pull. As you can imagine, routers are super messy, so make sure you clean up. It was super exciting to see this start taking its shape. I really made sure to take my time with the sanding, and I worked all the way up to 200 grit sandpaper. If you like what you're seeing, feel free to like and subscribe, as it would really help the channel. I don't get paid for these videos just yet, and I don't know if I ever will, but my hope is definitely to grow the channel. After everything was nice and sanded, I started staining. I wanted the tone to remain fairly light, so I used a Minwax Colonial Maple Wood stain. This was a really satisfying process because it ultimately changed the look of the piece. While the stain dried, I worked on the little frames for the burlap. I had to create a small wooden frame that would go on the inside of each panel. Each of these small boards was 3/4 of an inch by 3/4 of an inch. And of course the height and width are ultimately determined by the size of your panels. Once I had everything measured out, I just put them together using brad nails. This is going to make them sturdy, but also very flexible when needed. I made sure to test fit my piece. This took a lot of trial and error, but it was super important to leave an 1/8 inch gap on each side of the panel so that the burlap fits. This is considering the idea that I double layered my burlap. Make accommodations as needed and be sure to test everything out. Since this is a fabric, adhering it to the frame was pretty easy. I just used hot glue. Once one side is secure, you're going to want to apply constant tension on the opposite side so that the burlap doesn't sag. I had to run through this process 5 separate times, 2 for the side panels and then 3 for the doors. If you have enough material, I would practice on a scrap frame because it takes a moment to get the hang of it. Just so you can learn from my mistakes, one of my key takeaways was don't cut the material all that much. Leave an overhang on each side of at least 2 inches and you can remove it later. Right here, you can see that I cut the material way too short, and this ultimately caused problems for me. I had to redo that panel. But once I redid it, it fit right in perfectly. And I think it's starting to look pretty good, so tell me how you feel about it in the comments. Once my panel's alignment looked correct, I secured it into place using 1.5 inch brad nails. You can see a little bit of the burlap overhang that I mentioned earlier in the shot. Then I used a utility knife to cut off any of the excess material. Hopefully you didn't forget about the door handles. I cut this into 4-inch sections just to accommodate the size of the doors. I had to be careful with the handle and make sure that the wood didn't split. This meant that I had to pre-drill a hole to give the screw easy access. To make the position of the handle standard, I clamped a piece of wood to the door that positioned the handle at the halfway point. After that, I just went for it. I'm not really sure what's up with all the waves on the screen. It must be the Wi-Fi or the 5G in the air. But you can see the process a little more clearly here. I was a little scared to mess up, but I did also make another handle just in case. I got all the handles attached, and I attached the rest of the screws to the hinges. After that, I used Varathane's water-based polyurethane to coat the entire project. And there is no doubt in my mind that the 5G radiation helped the clear coat dry up a little faster. After that, that's all there is to it. You can throw in some shelves using pocket holes, and you can even attach a back panel using brad nails. I haven't done either of these yet, so my project ends here.